All right, today we're diving into a story that is absolutely forged in fire and betrayal. We're talking about a Celtic queen who became the living embodiment of vengeance and, get this, nearly broke the entire Roman Empire. So let's get into the incredible story of Boudica.
And really, this is the question at the very heart of her story. I mean, we're not just talking about some generic rebellion against an occupying army. No, this is about something so deeply personal, a violation so profound that it just unleashed an absolute firestorm across all of Roman Britain. You know, this quote from the Roman historian Cassius Dio, it says everything, doesn't it? It reveals so much about how the Romans thought. See, for them, it wasn't just the defeat that stung so bad. It was the fact that a woman was behind it all. I mean, to them, that was the ultimate, deepest humiliation. And it just goes to show you how completely Boudica shook their entire world.
Okay, so how did it all begin? How did we get here? Let's go right to that moment when a pretty fragile piece just completely shattered, turning a queen into a warrior. This is the exact point where a personal tragedy spirals into all-out war.
All right, let's set this scene real quick. After the Romans conquered Britain back in 43 AD, Boudica's tribe, the Iceni, they were what's known as a client kingdom. Basically, they got to keep their own king, Prasutagus, and were technically allies of Rome. But you gotta understand this was a really delicate balance, and it was all about to come crashing down when the king died around 60 AD.
Now, Prasutagus, he was no fool. He understood Roman greed all too well, so he comes up with this strategy. In his will, he names the Roman emperor himself, Nero, as a co-heir right alongside his own daughters. The hope, right, was that by giving the emperor a piece of the pie, they'd honor his wishes and protect his family. It was a pretty desperate political gamble, but you can see what he was trying to do.
And that gamble failed. I mean, it failed spectacularly. The Romans just saw an opportunity. They didn't recognize a woman's right to inherit anything, so they just tossed the will aside, annexed the entire kingdom, and started treating their so-called allies like a conquered enemy, just plundering everything they could get their hands on. And this is where the historian Tacitus lays it out, plainly and brutally. To completely break the Iceni spirit, the Romans didn't just take their stuff. They publicly flogged Queen Boudica, and they raped her young daughters. You have to understand, this wasn't just conquest. This was a calculated act of profound personal humiliation. It was designed to utterly subjugate them. But it had the exact opposite effect. Right here, this is the moment. This is where grief turns into pure fury. That unimaginable act of violence, it didn't break Boudica. Oh no, it unleashed her. What started as a mother's quest for justice was about to explode into a full-scale war against the entire Roman occupation.
And you know what? People were outraged. Hearing about the Romans' cruelty, other tribes just flocked to her banner. The historical sources suggest her army swelled to this incredible size. We're talking estimates of over 120,000 fighters. This was way more than just an uprising. It was a tidal wave of rebellion, and it was all united under one furious mother.
And that tidal wave? It crashed down with just shocking speed and ferocity. First, they completely razed Camulodunum. That was the big symbol of Roman oppression. Then, they ambushed and just annihilated the infantry of the Roman 9th Legion. And they weren't done. After that, they marched on the big commercial hubs, Londinium and Verulamium, and burned them to the ground.
Roman historians reported that across these cities, something like 70,000 Romans and their allies were killed. The rebels gave absolutely no quarter, meaning no mercy, no prisoners. Tacitus wrote that they were hasty with slaughter, with arson and the cross. They were seeking immediate, brutal revenge for what had been done to them.
And look, this isn't just some ancient propaganda or exaggeration. We have actual physical proof of this destruction. I mean, archaeologists today can literally dig down in these cities and find a thick red layer of burnt debris. It's called the Boudican destruction horizon. It's the evidence that these places were systematically torched, exactly like the historians said they were. But of course, a string of victories like this, it couldn't last forever. The Roman governor, a guy named Suetonius Paulinus, was a hardened professional general. He wasn't going to just let this happen. He regrouped his legions for one final winner-take-all battle. The fate of the entire province was going to be decided right here. So you have the Britons with just overwhelming numbers on their side. But Suetonius, he was smart. He chose his ground perfectly. He positioned his 10,000 men in a narrow pass with woods protecting their backs. This totally neutralized the Britons' main advantage. They couldn't get around to flank them.
It really was the classic matchup: Roman discipline and tactics versus just sheer numbers and raw ferocity.
And the result? Well, it was a slaughter. The disciplined Roman formations held. They broke the Britons' charge, and the entire rebellion was crushed in a single day. Roman sources claim that as many as 80,000 Britons died, both in the battle and in the chaos that followed. It was just a devastating end to the uprising.
So what happened to Boudica herself? Well, the two main historical sources we have actually disagree. Tacitus says she took poison, choosing death over the humiliation of being captured and paraded through the streets of Rome. Cassius Dio, on the other hand, suggests she just fell ill and died. But here's the key thing. Either way, she never became a Roman prisoner.
So you see, even in defeat, Boudicca had absolutely terrified Rome. The revolt was so violent and it came so incredibly close to succeeding that Emperor Nero himself actually considered abandoning Britain completely. Just pulling out. That's how deep of a psychological scar she left on the empire. But Boudicca's story doesn't really end with her death. In a lot of ways, her legend was just beginning. It's fascinating to see how this defeated queen was essentially resurrected centuries later, with her image totally reshaped to serve brand new purposes.
I mean, her reputation has gone on a wild ride through history. You look at the 17th century, and the famous poet John Milton is calling her a shameless harridan. Ouch. But then, fast forward to the Victorian era, and suddenly she's reinvented as this noble, heroic freedom fighter. And today? Well, today we see her as a much, much more complex figure. This poem, right here, from 1782, this was a huge turning point. The poet William Cowper completely reframed Boudica, or Boudicca, as she was often called back then. He painted her not as some savage, but as a sympathetic and heroic patriot. And that romantic image of a queen fighting for her people's freedom, it totally captured the public's imagination. And this leads us to maybe the greatest irony in her entire legacy. So, during the Victorian era, right when the British Empire is expanding all over the globe, who do they adopt as a symbol for their own imperial power? Boudica, the woman famous for fighting an empire. It's wild. She was even seen as a kind of ancient precursor to their own Queen Victoria. Today, we see her in a much more complicated light. I mean, on one hand, she's absolutely an icon of female leadership and indigenous resistance. But on the other hand, she's what some historians call a difficult hero. I mean, you can't ignore the massacres her army committed. She's this raw embodiment of maternal rage. But her story really challenges us to think beyond those simple black and white hero versus villain narrative. And in the end, it all comes back to the beginning, doesn't it? We never learn the names of her daughters. The very girls whose violations sparked this entire war, they remain these silent, nameless figures in history. But their mother's response, her all-consuming rage, that created a legend so powerful that here we are still telling her story 2,000 years later. So, that leaves us with the big question, right? Was Boudicca a righteous avenger, speaking the only language of violence her oppressors would ever understand? Or is her story a brutal, terrifying warning about where unchecked fury can lead? Maybe the most enduring part of her legacy is that she was both.